Welcome back to another episode of None of Our Businesses podcast, the podcast that focuses on current events in the world of accounting and finance, and not just from one accountant's perspective. I'm one of your hosts, AJ Wheeler. With me this week is Tammy Hess.
Hi.
And Charlie Zigman. Got a great show for you. Got a couple articles to discuss. We'll first discuss New York marijuana sales. They're going first to drug war victims for licensing in the state as recreational marijuana comes on board. We talk about, is it a good thing for those hurt by the drug wars to get a shot at this new industry? We'll talk about maybe the pitfalls that happens. Then the IRS plans to hire thousands, 10,000 to be exact. Is it enough? Is it too little, too late? Will you still be waiting on the phone 2 hours to talk to an IRS representative? We'll talk about all that and maybe their history of why this is a little too late, we think, but we'll talk about it. And then the SEC is only giving wrist slaps to audit firms that break independence rules. Do the punishments fit the crime? This author doesn't think so. We'll talk kind of our take on auditor independence, what that means, what it means when you break it, and the ripple effect that happens into businesses, and especially in the marketplace for companies that are publicly traded. And then we have a kind of a article that is biased in a way, but the title of it is "Corporations are shamelessly using inflation as a cover." Is it true that corporations are using the inflation smokescreen to raise prices unreasonably? This author thinks so. We'll break it down and kind of go through the article bit by bit and see if she has sound reasoning. And then Netflix password sharing. Is this an end of an era? Are you going to still be able to share your Netflix password? The streaming service is testing out how to stop that. And will it provide a boost to their bottom line? We'll talk about all that and the ramifications of it. But Charlie, you got our first article this week. Take it away.
So I've got an article we can talk about from Forbes called "New York Marijuana Sales Could Begin as Early as This Fall, and Drug War Victims Will Be the First Sellers." And so what the article calls justice-involved candidates are people who had previously been convicted in some kind of drug-related charge, and they're basically going to give them first chance to apply for permits this summer. First licenses should be awarded in late summer or potentially early fall. They set it up this way so that large companies, including the billion-dollar publicly traded companies that currently possess most of the state's medical cannabis licenses, won't be able to apply for recreational cannabis licenses or cultivation licenses until the end of the year. And so that's, again, to just give the justice-involved candidates a chance to get their licenses in place. And there are some people who are taking offense to this, and they're raising issues to say that, for example, they should be set up to where they require them to have had 2 years of running a business previously to applying for the cannabis business permit as an extra condition to stop people who maybe aren't ready for that kind of pressure of having an actual cannabis license. And so finally, one of the other points the article brings up was that one of the most important questions was whether those companies known colloquially as big weed would be better prepared than equity applicants to start selling cannabis. And so for me, I mean, the whole thing I found interesting in this was just the idea. I think it's a very cool idea that they're giving this opportunity to people who have been previously negatively impacted by that legislation. The only thing that's kind of like a question mark in my head is like, a part of me looks at it and says, well, the laws are what the laws were at some point in time, and they are what they are now. And so if we change course on a given law, I guess it's a question mark to me whether that means that people who were previously affected by that law should be absolved, right? Because at that time that was, still illegal. So on the one hand, I think it's very cool, but on the other hand, I think there's a little bit of debatability to that concept. And so I want to get your guys' take on what do you guys think? Does that make a lot of sense, or what do you guys think?
I think allowing those that were impacted by, something that's now been reversed isn't a big deal. I'm wondering if you're in that demographic of being, one of those drug war recipients, if you would even know or understand how to apply for these things. What I would rather see is an open kind of selection where, like there's some kind of help for somebody putting together these license and business plans and stuff, instead of just allowing, just making it open first to a certain group of people, allowing an open kind of thing. And if you want to help somebody come up to the level that one of those multi-state big weed or whatever is at, to give them the assistance and understanding of what they're signing up for, and allow them some resources to be able to put together a business plan and understand it. I worked with an organization that was a granting organization a long time ago, and it failed because it was a grant sharing, or it was a loan sharing. So you would give these micro loans out, they would get paid back, and then it was supposed to be a revolving loan fund. And what happened was these people just couldn't pay back their loans because they had no business savvy. And so it was at the heart of the loan program. It was very beneficial, and this was to serve Native Americans in low income businesses, or low income kind of families in Native American community. And it was heartbreaking because they didn't know how to run a business. And I feel the same way about this. Now, I mean, if you're an experienced drug dealer, maybe you can know to pay suppliers and understand AR and manage inventory costs and all that stuff. But I think if you're just somebody that got busted for having weed or something like that, and now you're first in line, this may sound like a good opportunity, but what you're really setting yourself up for is failure if you don't understand the business operations around it. I mean, we work in the cannabis industry, and we all understand how difficult inventory costing is and how important it is to have that there. And I'm just hoping that, these people aren't being set up for failure in this situation, and without having that proper backing, and education around it.
Yeah, I agree with you, AJ. I think that what's interesting to me is I like the idea of giving other, entrepreneurs a kind of a start, or a head start in the game. And I would say, regardless of their previous backgrounds, because a lot of the times applying for these licenses and having the big kind of multi-state cannabis companies that already know the process and have it in can have really they have an advantage of doing that, and so it could weed out some of the smaller individuals not to be able to participate. So I do like that idea of giving a head start and giving a little bit more time for folks to be able to apply for such licenses. But I really like the idea of what AJ was saying in terms of providing some education, because it is a lot to start a business and run it effectively and efficiently. And, even regardless, again, of the background in terms of whether or not they were, under they were being punished in the past for previous laws. I think the fact that they may have some business acumen, but they may need to have a little bit more education in that sense, or a little bit of advice in that sense, because times have changed in terms of they may not be in that marketplace anymore now that it has become legal. So I think a combination of the two would have been the ideal kind of situation. But I do think it's a very interesting and really kind of a proactive type of thinking for the state of New York.
Yeah, absolutely. And just to kind of put a cap on it, I'm all for anything that puts more power into the hands of small businesses as opposed to larger ones, if I can get there. And so I think this is a good way of doing that in a way that just makes sense. But yeah, do you have another article we can talk about, Tammy?
Yeah, I do. In previous podcasts, we have discussed the backlog of unprocessed tax returns that the IRS has been trying to tackle. In recent article from Accounting Today, they have provided an update on the IRS efforts. The IRS plans to hire 10,000 employees over the next year to help address the backlog of unprocessed tax returns, which is roughly about 20 million at the time of this article. So to give a little bit of a background, the article shared findings from a report issued by the Treasury Inspector General for Tax Administration, which noted some issues in the 2021 tax season, including tax credits that were incorrectly allowed, the 15.5% of service levels on phone calls to the IRS, and of course, the high level of unprocessed tax returns. The IRS agreed to the recommendations noted in the report, and it's working on addressing the issues, the biggest being having the appropriate staffing levels. The goal is to hire 5,000 employees in the upcoming months and an additional 5,000 over the next year. To achieve this goal, the IRS will be holding job fairs. And in addition to hiring, the IRS has also been reassigning employees from other functions to focus on the processing of returns. Congress has also approved a 6% funding increase for the IRS. So it would seem that things are headed in the right direction. However, in the past year, the IRS only met its hiring goals by 67%. So they kind of fell short on that. Back in May 2021, the IRS was short in filing over 800 positions to meet the demand of its 2 processing centers. In addition, the increase of the funding was only half of what was approved last year. So my question to you two is, do you think that the IRS will be successful in their hiring efforts? Or do you think that there is more? I can already see AJ shaking his head. But my second question is, do you think that there's more that the IRS can do in achieving the efforts of its hiring?
Oh, I have lots to say on this. The IRS is notoriously bad at hiring. So back when I was coming out of school back in like 2013, there was a hiring freeze. So the IRS looked like an attractive job, but they weren't hiring anybody. They said they had enough agents to go around, and that hiring freeze was to last 2 to 3 years. The problem is once you're out in the profession, that job position looks less and less attractive. So what you're really looking at from an IRS standpoint is you need to get competent people in at a base level and entice them with staying with the benefits of being part of a governmental unit. And the problem is that because this has been a staffing shortage and they're retroactively trying to fill empty seats, they don't have that kind, this is something that I think would take years to be able to fill that many seats, given the type of organization or government entity the IRS is. The other part of that is the IRS has notoriously been behind the times as far as day-to-day operations and being up with tech. I had a professor actually in my first year in university who used to work at the IRS, and into the early to even 2010, they were still using carbon copy handwritten papers for requests. I mean, they weren't paperless in any way. And you're talking about like carbon copy paper. So, these poor people at the IRS, also too, you talk about going postal, the frustration of hearing, your phone, if you're on the phone line of the IRS and answering tax questions, it's never a good conversation. I would venture to say 99 of every 100 calls is somebody screaming at you because they got a notice in the mail that is written probably in hieroglyphics to them, and they can't understand what you're asking. And so, it's a rough work environment, I think, and it's a rough ask to hire that many people in such a short amount of time, given the fact that you're not going to get the biggest, brightest minds in there at a level on a consistent basis from the pool of qualified applicants that are accounting majors, that make it out of school, just because the job market for us on the other side of that is so much better and so much more opportunity to be somewhere else other than the IRS. That doesn't mean they can't do it. They just have to go about it a different way than what they've been doing, I think, from a hiring perspective.
Yeah, I got to second that. I agree with all of that. I mean, they've just been not effective at keeping those roles staffed, and it just keeps getting harder and harder. And so I can't imagine them kind of reversing that trend, this late in it. And I think this batch of hiring is going to be a unique batch of hiring as compared to what they've been doing in the past, because this is kind of an emergency thing of putting a lot of people in place. And so it's going to create kind of this class at the IRS of the new coming class. And I think that just presents challenges that they don't get when they hire and scale up over time and promote people and whatnot from within. And so I think it'll be interesting to see. I think the other thing that's worth mentioning is, I don't know if this is just stuff that I've been seeing online, but I think there's a lot of people who are changing their opinions about who they work for and why and that kind of a thing. And I think that the desire to want to work for the IRS, regardless of trends and whatnot, I just think that's different today than it might have been 20 years ago. And I think there's a lot of people who are more eager to get into industry, particularly those people in accounting. I realize there's a lot of other jobs in the IRS that aren't specific to accounting, but I just could see people not signing up for that as easily today as they might have 30 years ago or something like that. And so, that's my thoughts on it.
Yeah, I think you both are on the right path here, because at the end of the day, I think the IRS has to do some rebranding in terms of why it would be great to work at the IRS. And then I think that's a challenge when you're, coming up to the tax deadline and you're going to try to do a large amount of hires to help not only with obviously the 2021 tax year, but the ones that they're backlogged from the year before. So it definitely is kind of high stress and probably a very difficult work environment at this point. So I'm not sure how successful job fairs will be, but I do think that they need to probably put all efforts into trying to get those people in and to really get the people who are there to stay and to help continue their efforts. So it'll be interesting to see how this unfolds and if they are able to hire the 5,000 people within the next few months. But I think time will tell, and it seems like they might have a little bit of a rocky start to all of that. All right, AJ, you have our next article.
Yeah. Well, and about that last one, I guess if you're having trouble getting a job out of school, probably IRS is the best place for you to get a little bit of a quick, easy start in your accounting career. But anyway, switching gears to public accounting, I have an article here that was written by Going Concern, and it's titled "The SEC Gives Out Wrist Slaps to the Big Four When They Break Independence Rules on Providing Non-Audit Service to Audit Clients." So I wanted to start by kind of addressing what non-audit services are. When you're an independent CPA firm and you're auditing, and this is regarding SEC, so you're talking Big Four, peekaboo rule audits, you are not allowed to offer non-audit services to your clients to remain independent, meaning you can't do bookkeeping work for them. You can't do a monthly close. You should not be doing managerial accounting, consulting. The list goes on. You can't own any certain amount of stock in that client up to a certain percent. You can't have family that works there. And it's all to create independence in form and structure so that you can objectively audit the numbers of these large publicly traded companies. The article itself goes into essentially saying that the Big Four firms get very little kind of reprimand if they happen to cross those lines. So they list kind of what can't be done by firms, including affiliates. And essentially, a lot of the large firms have blown by that, and they simply pay the fine when found. And the article correctly brings up something that we've talked about privately, I think, in the industry for a long time, is that can auditors really be independent when they're being paid millions of dollars to audit a company? I have a little personal experience in this that I can share later, but there is some financial incentive for you to go through an audit and have the most favorable outcome happen for your client. So essentially, they're saying, the highest kind of wrist slap that they gave was $8.2 million to KPMG in 2014, but they far exceeded that in revenue and during that year, and it's a small price to pay for doing business if you're including like the consulting, the actuarial, the managerial consulting practice that's tacked on to your audit service for your clients. So essentially, they go through a list of these fines and how it doesn't really add up to much. And it hits all four of them. So none of the Big Four, PwC, E&Y, Deloitte, KPMG, they're all guilty here. But the author kind of wraps it up that these fines from the SEC are just a drop in the bucket for multi-million-dollar big firms like the Big Four. Auditor rules are a farce, and fines to the Big Four and other firms for auditor independent violations are false. And this new SEC investigation will probably be a farce too. I think it kind of echoes the sentiment of a lot of people in the general public that these corporations are probably not held to the same standards that you and I are held to. And we're kind of seeing it in this article, or at least portrayed in this article. So my question to both of you, do you think the article is kind of off base? Do you think there is independence in this and these are isolated incidents that may have happened? Do you think this is something that kind of transfers into audits outside of the SEC or publicly traded companies, into private companies? Audits are not only, financial independent audits like this are not only performed, for publicly traded companies, but they're also performed for private and nonprofits as well. So, and if maybe what they can do to reverse this trend, I guess. What would be your solution to this? Because the author doesn't really offer a solution. They're just laying out what their opinion that these are very low fines for what's happening.
Yeah, no, I think this absolutely does happen. I think it's a big problem, and that I think it's also a very difficult problem to solve. I think the fact that we see it everywhere is a hint that it's a systemic issue and it's not just an individual firm and that kind of a thing. And then I think just thinking about how the punishment for these kinds of things would work. I mean, just the first bar would be if the fee is less than if the penalty that you're levied for breaking some rule is less than the fee that you collected from the audit, that would be a starting point to say, okay, maybe the fee is not effective at producing its end result. Another thought to that is like how many, for whatever percent you think you don't catch, right? So if you catch a guy and you get him in trouble with a fee, if you believe that 5 others went uncaught during that same period of time, well, then the punishment needs to kind of be built with that in mind. It should be large enough to, offset that activity for even if 4 of them get away or whatever. And so, on the one hand, I see that the only thing I kind of took argument with in the article was that it mentions the size of the fee. And it basically says, how can you be objective if you are collecting a fee? And I think, or if the fee is large enough that it's a problem, I think that one's a little bit tricky because I mean, the size of the fee is relative to whatever the size of the work is. And we definitely don't take issue with the idea that auditors would get paid. I don't think that's like what anyone's really arguing. I think it's more just what we're arguing is the relationship of that fee to the work that was performed and if that's a good connection. But I think there's still a lot of incentive for an audit firm to produce a bad result for a client, even when that client is paying them, because the audit firm knows that their entire reputation is kind of staked on if this later comes out to find out that actually there was a bunch of deficiencies that they've missed and swept under the rug. Then suddenly they can't sell and be an audit firm because now they've tarnished their own reputation. And we've seen this. So I feel like that's a real thing. And that, to me, that makes it so that you can't just call out the fee and say, oh, the fee is the problem. It's a little more systemic. What do you think, Tammy?
Yeah, so I think this article is very biased, I think, in that sense, and very harsh in terms of the regulation and rules for the auditing firms in general. But I will say I do think that the fees should probably be higher and make it be more of a penalty, in some cases. And obviously, I think if there was one, I think there was even 10 million reference there, where that's a significant amount of money. And granted, the organization was probably still profitable, but you're also looking at these big 4 that are, international, very large kind of infrastructure. So I don't know necessarily how much that fee was in relation to the actual audit fee, but I do think it needs to be something where it is substantial, where it does hurt the overall companies. But I would also say that there are other, independence rules and regulations are also tied to a CPA license and things of that nature. So where the SEC could be fining the organization, there are other legal issues in terms of the Board of Accountancy and revoking their licenses and their ability to perform going forward. And so I'm not sure what those rates are in terms of the findings that they listed in the article. But I do think that the independence is huge and a very key thing for not obviously just for publicly traded companies, but in practicing public accounting in general. So I do think there's something to be looked into on that as well, to ensure that those fees and regulations and that firms and professionals are held accountable if they are crossing those independence rules. So it'd be interesting to give, a little bit more detail in this article of kind of like the well-rounded viewpoint of actually what does occur when these things happen and what's the actual kind of penalty all in for that particular professional that is involved in something like this.
Yeah. Great points, Tammy. I think just my personal take on this is nothing's going to happen until this becomes a big problem again. So this article isn't going to draw the public's attention to this, like say an Enron scandal did back in the day. And what happened at the end of that Enron scandal was essentially Big 4 or Big 5 when it was back then split off their consulting practices from their main CPAs. It was all moved out of house. What then happened slowly over the last 20 years or so is they brought it back in-house. And a lot of these big four firms, well, all of them now have consulting practices that do everything underneath the bullet points in this article that impair your independence. So I would say the move that's probably going to happen here, if this doesn't stop, is if there is another financial backlash like Enron that gets into the public sphere, because right now, nobody's talking about this in the general public. But when it does, if it does get out where something like that happens, I think the SEC will probably step in then, or regulators at a federal level will step in and remove those type of conflicting businesses and make it have to be separate. You know, you can't be under the same roof in management. And I think that's what will happen. And I agree with Tammy. I think this article is pretty biased from one side, but you have to understand that I think this should be a concern to everybody if this is blurring the lines, you know, and especially in the SEC or under a peekaboo audit like this, because you're talking about the financial stability of the markets here. And if there is some funny business there, it affects everybody. Unlike a small private business or even a nonprofit, the blowback or the repercussions of that audit being incorrect or misled, it affects less people than the entire US market. And so I just think it's going to take something like Enron again to make change, but it's good, I think, that it's called out and shown here. I mean, we see articles all the time about CPA firms behaving badly, but it doesn't make it past our sphere into the general public. And when that happens, I think that's when you'll see something happen with these large firms and independence rules. Charlie, do you have our next article for us?
Sure. Yeah, I've got another one from maybe another biased source, but let's take a look. So from sheerpost.com, it's called "Corporations Are Shamelessly Using Inflation as a Cover." And so, like I said, it's incredibly biased, but I happen to kind of agree with it a little bit on it. So I'm going to just kind of go with it. But basically it says, yeah, corporations are quick to blame this new reality on the pandemic, but their own profiteering is the actual reason. And what the author does is he runs an organization that collects earnings reports and among other things. But one of the things they do is they collect these earnings reports and transcripts, and then they kind of peruse them to see what these CEOs are really saying inside of those earnings reports. And what they're saying is that they're actively letting people know that, hey, the pandemic has created this cover for us to go ahead and raise prices, and we can blame it on inflation. And then the customers are now grown to expect it. And so we're going to turn around and tell the investors that profits are rising and things are great. But when a customer asks, it's, inflation, bad, that kind of a thing. And so I think it's just kind of this, I don't know, it's them taking a chance to really take advantage of this situation. The article called out some specific examples that I thought were just kind of a little over the top. And so I want to share them. It said that Constellation Brands, the parent company of the popular beers Modelo and Corona, was doing this. And then on its January call, the CFO admitted that its consumer base skews a bit more Hispanic and that the company wants to, quote, take as much as we can from them. And so I did not listen to that call. I did not hear those words, but that's what's in the article. And so I just thought that it's really interesting it's really interesting what they would say on an earnings call, which, by the way, is public. So when you think you're talking to the customers versus when you're talking to your investors, by the way, you're actually talking to both of them all the time because those earnings calls are public. And finally, there is a recently introduced bill designed to stop this called the COVID-19 Price Gouging Prevention Act. And that's going to help the Federal Trade Commission and state attorney generals to protect people across the country from this. And so I guess I've kind of let out my opinion on it, but I want to hear what you guys think. Do you think that these companies are actively using the pandemic as a cover to pad profit margins, or is this just a real thing that's happening? Prices are really rising, and this guy is looking for a reason to be upset. What do you think?
So I would say that I think it could be a combination of both. To be honest, I think that there are probably some cases where people are are kind of relooking at things now, and hopefully we're towards the end of the pandemic, and maybe things are they're trying to improve their profit margins and things of that nature, and they're utilizing some excuses or whatever to do that. But I do think prices are rising. So, and I do believe that at the end of the day, when in most situations, when you have your costs are increasing, then you do end up having to pass that cost increase to the consumer. And so it does have a kind of rippling effect to that. The other thing I was thinking about this, because I would say, to your point, Charlie, this article is very, very biased, and it was also picked up kind of the snippets, right? So what we aren't seeing is what happened the year before or the year before that, were their profits margins taking a hit because of the situation, and what they were doing in operations or in their supply chain, but they didn't pass along those costs, and so now they're trying to recoup that going forward, and they're using this time as the time to do that. I do think there's probably some truth, and there are probably some companies that did hold prices, even though they were in a normal situation, they would have increased it, but they didn't because of the pandemic or because of the situation that we were facing, last year and the year before. So, yeah, I wish that this article, kind of similar to the previous article, gave a little bit more history and context about what is it that we're looking at. Let's look at trends, because one data point doesn't necessarily give you the full story of things. And I think that is what this part's missing, where, it's really hard to say, yes, all these companies are just, are hiding behind the pandemic or the supply chain issues and all that kind of stuff, without really seeing all the kind of bullet points and trends of the history and what they're planning on for the future. So that's just my take. What about you, AJ?
No, I think this article is unabashed, kind of really skewing towards a much, a different one type of political view, I think, and it comes through, I think, in the snippets that they're collecting from the different earning calls. And what I would say is they're very small snippets, so they're quoting what's said. There's no context behind it, and there, I would feel better if the article was written with full context of the text there. I suppose we want to get as much as we can. That's the only part of the quote that's in there from the Modelo brand, for instance. And I just feel like if I had better context of it, instead of 4 words that's taken, from one part of the speech and, a sentence from another part of the earnings call, I would have a better idea about what they're talking about. It's very inflammatory the way it's written, and it does read pretty gnarly, to be honest, as far as like being pretty harsh toward the consumer. What I would say is, when we're talking about Modelo or any alcohol brands here, that raised during the pandemic. Everybody was home, they were drinking more, and that was increased. So I don't think it's a bad, I don't think it's a bad sales strategy to say, let's see if we can move that price up a little bit. People have become accustomed to drinking this much, and it may or may not have to do with inflation. I would say that, with rising distribution costs and the price of gas right now, they probably are incurring more cost, and then they probably would have to raise their price, but why not try to raise it just a little bit more if people are willing to pay it? So I don't see an inherent problem with trying to play the market and seeing what you can sell your product for. What I would have a problem with is if people just, like a water company, there's a water shortage and they're charging more for water, or all of a sudden energy is doubling in price, your home energy bill is doubling in price just because, and I think there's regulation around that to make that happen. And I support this pandemic price gouging kind of initiative as well. But I don't think that, inherently, like, the market is, I guess I don't see these individual companies trying to gouge people unless it's blatant and they have good, they have good evidence to support that. But I'm also not naive enough to think that, this doesn't happen at all. So, could it be? Yes, but I don't think the article does a good job of presenting a case that makes it so that the ones that they're representing, they're saying that they have evidence of this. I don't see much of it in the article. I would want to see numbers run. I would want to see how much the cost of something has increased, and then show me that compared to the rising transportation costs or the inflation, of $1 over the last year, and then show me how that plays into the pricing. And then we can make an educated decision about how much that price is raised versus the raise in transportation costs, the raise in inflation. need to compare apples to apples. And this article doesn't do a good job of doing so, especially around a financial topic where there's no numbers in the article. So we really don't know what that comparison is.
Yeah, and to add to that too, AJ, I think the other thing to think about is compare it to the industry. Because what if, and I don't know enough about some of these companies that they referenced, but what if, in theory, the beer manufacturer was actually priced way below market, and even though now they're taking a bigger jump in pricing, they're actually being more competitive with their peers, right? So I think that you need a little bit more information, but I would be shocked if that one line about gouging a certain, sector or individual group or whatnot, just because, and see what they can. If that was actually said, not only is that not professional, and I think that would cause a lot of fire on that point of view. I wouldn't agree with that. That should not be the justification for your price increase by any means. So I kind of want to go back and now listen to that whole entire investor call to see, how if it was said and how it was said, and, to see if there's any kind of reaction to that, because that is a much bigger deal, I think, in that sense. But yeah, I think more information about this would be really beneficial. And I think after I saw this article, Charlie, that you had sent, I started doing some research just to look at company and look at I went back for like 5 years just to kind of see what their gross margins were doing. And it was in the one example I looked at, it was kind of, they took a hit early in 2020 and they kind of were flat, and they just kind of bumped it up to make it comparable to where they were back in 2019 and 2018. So I was like, oh, that makes sense to me. But I think anytime you do a price increase, regardless, and regardless if you're a publicly traded company or not, and you have to do investor calls, but you need to have that review and that support, because most consumers are going to want to know why. And I think it can be justifiable if it is because your costs are going up, or if it's because something else, or you're trying to be more competitive to other infrastructures, or that you were actually losing money before. I think the story is really important, especially in these times where people are really conscious about what they're paying for certain products.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I agree completely. And I think that's a really good point about the profiteering being kind of based around essential activities, because I do think that there is a big difference here when we're talking water versus when we're talking beer. And so I'm actually kind of glad that the article pointed that out as its example, because I think it's really easy one to refute on that basis. So yeah, we'll see how that all plays out. But yeah, do you guys have another article we can talk about?
I do. So keeping in line with our pricing conversation, have you been sharing your Netflix password? Well, according to an article from CNN Business, Netflix knows that you do, and it may start charging for it. Netflix is testing out 2 new features in Costa Rica and Peru called Extra Member and Profile Transfer. Under the Extra Member feature, the user can add up to 2 people they don't live with to their existing account. The extra members will have a profile and login at a discounted rate. And under the Profile Transfer feature, the user can transfer their profile information, basically their watch history, to a new account that they would pay for. So Netflix shared in a post that sharing passwords has impacted its ability to invest in great new content for users. And the article also stated that while Netflix has turned a blind eye to password sharing in the past, now with roughly 222 million subscribers, and with the competing people in the marketplace, it is now thinking of new ways to bring in revenue. Now they're kind of, couching this with saying this is in order to provide premium content and bring in new users and keep existing users happy. Their article also noted that investors are worried about Netflix slowing growth as its stocks went down by 41% this year, and the subscriber outlook in January was weaker than expected. So my question is, does this path forward make sense, and will this help or hinder Netflix's position?
I saw this article, and I always wondered why Netflix is like the poster boy for raising prices and like cutting off access, because I cut cable a long time ago, and I have Hulu, and you're not allowed to share Hulu at all. If you try to log in from a different location, it asks you if you want to make this home location. You can only make that switch once. So this is not something new to like a streaming service, but Netflix always seems the one to get the blowback. Back when they wanted to raise prices for their monthly fee, everybody threw a hissy fit, and they backed off that decision, eventually raising it a little bit to what it is now. So it's not, and the new, golden goose for especially for content, mills like Netflix, YouTube, Hulu, Paramount Plus, you can go down the list of these subscription services, is a subscription service. Apple's got into it. I mean, everybody has a subscription service now. And the reason why they like it so much is it's a reoccurring charge that everybody forgets about. So they get your $5.99, $15.99, whatever it is a month, indefinitely almost, and they can count on that revenue to churn every month. It's, and they don't have to do anything for it. They're just providing the service. So these subscription services are really attractive from like a financial growth standpoint and from a subscriber-based standpoint. I think the thing that I don't think this is going to push anybody off of Netflix or onto Netflix or anything like that. What I do think is it's going to cause a little bit more friction in that. I mean, there's already so much competition in that area, and where you choose to pull your entertainment from. I can see maybe this, for the lower income or somebody that's, median level and below, this may be a price, but for the majority of people, I think it wouldn't be much to pay an extra $3 a month, and have somebody kick in to use your password or whatever. But it could be a decision for some people that, live paycheck to paycheck. So it'd be interesting to see, I guess, the demographic of if this makes a change, if this brings in more revenue. I have a feeling that it will bring in more revenue, but will that be offset by people getting mad about it and then just illegally streaming it anyway? So I don't, necessarily know if it's going to be a net positive for them. I think you have to weigh the good with the bad, and the good being the extra revenue, the bad being any kind of bad publicity, hence CNN Business is doing an article on this. So it'll be interesting to see, but I don't necessarily know this moves the needle much. I mean, there's probably only so much like entertainment dollars to go around, and the market is so saturated that you're probably at where you're at by now. Everybody has a streaming service. So I don't think it'll make much of a difference, but I could be wrong.
Well, I'll tell you what, I mean, as I read this article, I took offense. It says, that you have been sharing your password. And what he failed to consider is that half of us are on the receiving end of that password. So I don't share anything. Okay. I just pick up whatever somebody else's password they give me. And, I think that there is some argument to be on a subscription service, even if you don't think people are going to forget them, because I think in the businesses that I've worked with that try to implement subscriptions, it is partially for that reason. It's nice that people will forget it and just keep using it. A lot of times it's more about trying to align your revenue stream with your cost structure. And you're just trying to say, if I pay developers every month, then I would like my customers to go ahead and pay me on that same basis. Or in their case, obviously it's more geared at TV and television and different shows and whatnot. But, that's one thing I think about when I'm reading this article is just that just sometimes makes good sense to have that kind of a plan. I do think that there will be some level of pushback to this, because I think people have Netflix has kind of been, people have gotten used to it as what it is. And so when you start to change that service, even though you may look at it and go, well, it's not fair that they were sharing in the first place, or it was never the intended proper use of the business model in the first place. It's like, well, that's what people are used to now. So when you change it, whether that was ever right, that's where their outrage will show up. And so I do think that $3 versus the original price, which I know there's different pricing models, but I do think that sounds like the right number to give, because it's small enough that it would still, like you said, a lot of people would just ignore that. I read that on there that they were also testing it out in some smaller markets in Chile and in a few other places. And so we'll see if their tests there are what they were hoping to see before they roll it out universally. But I could definitely see that coming in the near future.
I do like how they did say, like, they gave a justification as to why they're going to be doing this, right? So it's not just because they're missing out on revenues because other people are, sharing their passwords, which is probably obviously the main piece of that. But they did, to couch it with saying, this will allow us to give you more content and a better content and all this kind of thing. I think that the pressure is going to be if this does launch, and then people are going to be wanting to see how did that increase? How are they able to invest those that higher level of revenue into new content? Is it really going to make existing users happy? Is it going to make draw new people to the marketplace? Because there are so many subscriptions out there, and I think that's the part that does get annoying. Is that at the end, if you look at it, a ton of, subscription models are happening now. Even like normal cable TV shows or channels are offering their plus programs at a higher fee, for, something per month. You start adding all of that together and you are starting to, spend a lot of money for entertainment. And I do think that when people start really looking at that, that might be where they push back. And then the blowback could be back on Netflix because they're the ones that are changing this or kind of, getting blamed for some of the new things that are happening, are like what AJ said, the poster candidate for all things that happen in this marketplace. So we'll see what happens. And it'll be interesting to see how that test run goes in those two countries.
All right, everybody, that's going to do it for the None of Our Businesses YouTube show and podcast. Please tune back in again next week for more business updates from an accountant's perspective. And also check out our sister podcast, Profitless on Purpose, where they're talking anything and everything relating to the nonprofit space. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.